Hello, contrarian capitalists. Hope you're doing well. I've got an absolutely fantastic treat for you today. My guest is Doomberg. We're going to be talking about all things energy. We're probably even going to do a little round the world stop for you. Doomberg, thank you for taking the time out. How are you today?
Robert, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to a fantastic discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Before we get going with Argentina, because that's where I'd like to start, uh, a bit of backstory about yourself, if you must, because people that are watching the video of this are going to be looking at a green chicken. And for those that are not familiar with Doomberg, a bit of backstory about the green chicken and a bit about yourselves, if that's okay, please.
You bet. Yeah, we are a very small team of former industry executives who specialize and come from the commodity energy complex. We started a business together several years ago, focusing on consulting for C-suite and family office types. And then COVID hit, and like many small business owners, we lost 85% of our book of business and had to reinvent ourselves. And a good friend on Wall Street, a name you would know, gave us some advice that said you should consult people who create and sell content into Wall Street and help them run their businesses better, which was an interesting idea. And we did, and we rebuilt our business post-COVID again, like many small business owners were forced to do, and had some very good success in that regard. Studied the market carefully, and our best client one day said to us, why don't you do your own? There's an inefficiency in the market that you could fill, and I would support you, and I think you'd be great at it. And Doomberg was born. It succeeded well beyond our wildest imagination. And if I had to summarize, the primary driver for that success is we bring the industry voice to the energy debate that was sorely lacking. The vast majority of people who participate in the energy debate come from either government or academia. Most people with industrial expertise are hidden behind public affairs teams, investor relations teams. We suffer from no such constraints. And so we get to bring the industry lens to the most important challenge of the day. And as a consequence of that, we have scores of thousands of people from industry feeding us ideas, acting as sources, confirming or perhaps correcting any of our articles before we publish them, and generating great ideas for pieces. And so through that, we've written 315 articles now, and we're, by some miracle, the largest paid finance Substack in the world, which is amazing to say and humbling and life-changing all at once. But that's the sort of brief, 5-minute version or 4-minute version of Doomberg and the arc of our history.
And with reference to green chicken in particular, how did that idea come about?
Well, there are 5 pillars to any business, and brand is one of them. And we have a strategic plan for all 5 of those: brand, channel, technology, demand creation, and operations. And one of the challenges we had as a team is that we were starting with 0 social media footprint, and we have some pretty strong marketing background on our team. And one of the old adages is that you can't be remembered if you don't stand out. So if it had just been my plain middle-aged face as the brand, which many content creators decide by default, I think if you were sort of sweeping through Twitter, you wouldn't have stopped to see what's going on with this account. Whereas the green chicken with the startled eyes and the name Doomberg, which is came from a deep study of who we thought our ideal clients might be, relatively wealthy, successful people who are afraid of losing it and do a lot of doom scrolling. And so the brand concept initially was Chicken Little gets a terminal. We love our Bloomberg terminal and big fans of the product, expensive as it might be. And so Doomberg was born, the green chicken. And once you sort of blow up as a brand, we could never really de-anonymize because it destroys the brand mystique. Hundreds of people know who we are. It's not some big secret. We don't really care. It's not like we're afraid of, quote unquote, being doxxed in any meaningful way. But the brand has been built. It's a good brand. We're proud of the brand. And when people hear the name Doomberg or see the green chicken, they know what they're getting, which is hopefully high quality pieces that makes them laugh a few times and teaches them a few things and doesn't hold too much of their attention for too long, and gives them that dopamine hit that they're looking for when our email lands in their inbox. And so the brand ambition of Doomberg is, when our email arrives in your inbox, the gut feeling we induce in you is, ooh, I get to read that. And to the extent that we could create that gut feeling in our ideal clients, then we have succeeded as a brand. And last thing I would say about brand is what they say it is, not what you hope it is. And so we're always cognizant of delighting our ideal clients, writing high quality pieces, very tightly edited, a bit of humor but not being silly, and a bit of teaching without being self-indulgent, and being provocative without being polarizing. Those are the three anchors of our brand, and they all flow from the Doomberg masthead.
Awesome. I thank you for giving a bit of background on that. It's quite a lot of lessons there, I think, for people that are looking to just start and create something. That being said, I'm sure there are going to be people listening to this that are going to say, Rob, come on, get on with it now. Let's talk energy. Let's start our little worldwide tour in Argentina, and let's head over there, because I was reading one of your many previews that you send out on Substack. This is called Cash Cow, and this is looking at Javier Milei's government, and all sorts of funny things have been going on down there. But he seems to have taken quite a positive stance on energy. I was just wondering if you can just go in detail about what he's done and what you think he's looking to achieve moving forward.
So to properly contextualize Milei, I think you need to obviously understand Argentinian history, which of course I'm sure most of your audience is familiar with, given the relationship with the UK. It's been a bit of a basket case, if we're being honest. That's a lost century, as we described it in the piece. And Milei was voted into office on the heels of a campaign promise to basically impose shock therapy on the country. He is wildly pro-American, as we say in the piece, almost suspiciously so. At every opportunity, takes the full-throatedest pro-American position possible, be it China, Israel, Ukraine, and so on. And he's tossed the die of Argentina into the lot of a pro-American, pro-energy, pro-capitalist policy. And this is no small thing, as we pointed out in the piece, for a variety of reasons. And I'll take a couple of them in order if you indulge me. First and foremost, they're in possession of a massive and globally consequential hydrocarbon deposit, most particularly the Vaca Muerta shale, which is, at least from a resource perspective, almost every bit as good as the Permian Basin. And we could talk about some of the details that we've since learned after publishing the piece, as people come out of the woodwork and send us things that we hadn't seen before we wrote it. It is a massive global hydrocarbon deposit that is prolific, and with the right set of government support structure, would be among the best shales in the world, and certainly the biggest outside of North America by a wide margin. Second is Argentina and Milei are running the sort of exact opposite experiment that Sir Keir Starmer and the new Labour government in the UK are running. So on a plot from Milei to Starmer is basically everybody else. And so we're going to get a firsthand economic verdict on energy strategy. I mean, Starmer has worked very hard to stunt the development of fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, and of course coal, and is going all in on renewables. And Milei is taking the exact opposite approach, which is global warming is a hoax, and we are going to generate hard US dollars to close any draining of our reserves. We're going to beat the back of inflation by doing so. If he had his way, and he doesn't, because he doesn't have total parliamentary sort of powers in the way that Starmer does. I mean, Starmer could basically do whatever he wants for the next several years. Milei has to compromise, and so he wanted to dollarize, for example, which would have been real shock therapy for the economy, but hasn't quite been able to do that yet. And so they passed this law. It became law, I believe, in June or July. And the Ley Bases bill, which is radically pro-business, pro-extraction, pro-fossil fuels, in a way that is almost unprecedented. And the big question, we believe, is will the international flow of investor dollars believe that he'll be there long enough to see things through? In other words, that the benefits of such a policy will be firmly established so as to persist beyond his personality, his leadership. Because if he were to, heaven forbid, go through the Donald Trump treatment, that would knock a lot of momentum and cause a lot of investors to pause on the money flowing into the country that will be necessary in order to fully realize the benefits of his extractive policies. That's what the environmentalists call it, of course, extractivism. There's no shortage of isms in the world. But this is the experiment being run. Given what we do for a living, we're watching it with significant interest. And if it can be pulled off, I think it would make a very fascinating contrast to what we suspect, almost certainly know, will result from Starmer's policies in the UK. And given the fact that these two countries have been at war with each other and have both been bailed out by the IMF at various points in their histories, it makes for an interesting contrast, one of the most interesting in the world right now, in our view.
Yeah, I would. I totally agree with that, and we will come on to the UK in due course. So there's one other country I'd like to visit before we get to the United Kingdom. Why do you think Javier Milei has gone down this route? Is it just because it's part of his ethos of that's who he is, and I'm going to shove it to X, Y, and Z? Or, I appreciate he's a very smart individual. Do you think he's actually looking at all the wonderful natural resources that Argentina has, and he says, hang on a minute, we should actually make better use of this. We've had far too many years of, Peronism, socialism, whatever it might be, and actually we should maximize its potential for our country because this is what we could be doing as Argentina.
He's an interesting character, and I can't say that I fully understand the phenomenon that is Milei. If you wanted to get conspiratorial, he's right out of central casting for sort of pro-American plant. The U.S. in this sort of framework has decided that it wants to reenact the Monroe Doctrine, and we're putting out another piece shortly here over the weekend that will follow up on that thread, and it focuses on Brazil when we're making a bit of a bold call in that regard. But in a world where the U.S. is broadly energy independent, no longer really reliant on the Middle East, then suddenly the Western Hemisphere might be big enough for what's needed. And suddenly Milei comes out of nowhere, literally out of central casting, and pulling all of the levers that one would pull in the sort of traditional Austrian school of economics, small government, pro-corporate, pro-big business, develop the resources for the people, balance the reserve outflow with hard dollars coming in because you're selling the world's most important commodities for those dollars, and a full-throated support of U.S. International policy so that you buy the protection, basically, of the biggest bully in the Western Hemisphere, or the biggest, whatever, bully is probably the wrong word, but you get what I'm saying. And so there's a move afoot. If we just take a step back and look at Latin America, and maybe this is not where you wanted to go, but you have Guyana, major oil deposits. The Western majors are assembling like an armada, both on and off their shores, clearly in the U.S. camp. Argentina, clearly in the U.S. camp. Colombia, complex relationship with the U.S. Ecuador just quit OPEC and signed a deal to provide weapons to Ukraine, which was scuttled when Russia banned the import of bananas from Ecuador, one of those strange stories of 2024 that probably wasn't on too many people's radars. And then you have Brazil, which is the biggest prize in Latin America. So Milei is playing, we believe, a shrewd set of cards. Look, we think it's the correct policy, so his motivations actually aren't all that relevant. We believe if he is given the time to execute that policy, it will be a stark contrast to what we suspect will happen in the UK, which I know we'll talk about later. And so who he is and where he came from and what his true motivations aren't really all that relevant if your job is to try to analyze global energy flows and what it means for various countries.
I think that's fair enough. And I think myself included, sometimes it could be quite challenging to make that distinction between the two. You look at the man, the myth, the legend, or however you want to describe him, versus energy itself. So yeah, I appreciate. I should probably rein myself in as well. Before we head over to Europe then, Doomberg, is there any other, I appreciate there'll be an article coming out about Brazil, so maybe you don't have to talk about that. Is there any other generic Latin American, South American news or any other energy issues that people might not know about that you think is important that people do know about?
Yeah, I don't mind talking about the article that has not yet published. People will still read it. And we're making a bit of a bold call. So there's a major meeting that Russian President Vladimir Putin is hosting in Kazan, the BRICS summit of October. We think it's not getting near enough press coverage in the West for its potential significance. And if you read between the lines, there's a move afoot to develop an alternative to the US dollar system, especially for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. And it is widely anticipated that Putin, who currently chairs the rotating chairmanship of BRICS, is hoping to deliver the sort of the death knell to the US dollar system and to create a multipolar world and to finally defeat Anglo-American hemorrhage and all of this stuff. Well, it's our view that Anglo-American hegemony can't both be omnipowerful and then also completely impotent to fight back against such a move. And the B in BRICS is Brazil. And Lula could scuttle the whole thing and might actually be sort of a wolf in sheep's clothing for the upcoming Kazan summit in that Putin is hosting. And so it's an out there prediction, but there's an awful lot of excitement, especially in the sort of the gold bug community, that gold will replace U.S. Treasuries as the neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade, and Putin is going to defeat NATO on the battlefield in Ukraine, and it's giving all this technology to China, which is going to make them a military superpower, and they'll swallow up Taiwan, and that's possible. But the U.S. and the U.K. have, if you believe such, I would, to use a terrible term, conspiratorial thinking, and many people do, then you also have to understand that these are not empires that are without that are without any counterpunches. And given Lula's relatively close relationship with the Democratic Party in Washington, D.C., mumblings about whether the last election might not have been tilted in his favor by such forces, and his recent full-throated support for regime change in Venezuela, which is a major U.S. foreign policy objective, one can't help but wonder that on the most important thing of the day, whether Vladimir Putin gets to lay down the trump card against Biden and Harris, pun intended, whether Lula might not be the one that scuttles the whole thing at the last moment, much to the embarrassment of Putin. So that is the thrust of the piece. It's not quite making the call that it will happen, but it's putting it on people's radars that it might, and if it did, it would make a lot of sense.
I love your comment there about conspiratorial thinking. Call it contrarian thinking. This is a contrarian capitalist podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
After all, we do love alternate views, or what I would consider, what most mainstream people would consider alternate views. I mean, it's the nooks and crannies of that I enjoy. And again, there's a lot of information there in the article or in the Substack post that comes with this podcast. Again, I'll send people over to your Substack and that particular article, because this will come out. This podcast will come out after the Brazil piece has been released, so I'll do that. Moving over to Europe then, and before we hit home with Turkey, Starmer, UK, etc. I read something interesting. It was on the internet, and it was power prices in France turned negative last week, and they cited tepid demand, struggling economy, and increased renewables generation. Whereas at the same time, the UK seems to be saying completely opposite things. I mean, our energy prices are through the roof. Why do you think, and I appreciate that, I think 70% of France's electricity comes through their nuclear, or something along those lines. Why such a disparity? Oh no, what's the right word I'm looking for? Disparity. Why the disparity between what France is saying and what the UK is saying and doing at the moment?
The first thing that you have to realize when you see such articles is that they almost always get the most important part of the story wrong. So the key parameter that you're missing in quoting negative prices is over what time frame. So day ahead electricity prices, whenever you have the introduction of a critical mass of intermittent renewables, are very common and not a positive sign. In other words, the inelasticity of demand for electricity is such that you will see wild swings. When the sun isn't shining and there's no wind, suddenly prices spike. And when there's a gust of wind and it's a bright sunny day, you have to throttle nuclear power plants, for example, which is very expensive and difficult to do in order to make room for what many would call parasitic sources of intermittent electricity like wind and solar. And the propaganda of the day is such that all benefits are accrued only to wind and solar, and all incremental costs for their presence are assigned to the other fuel sources. And so, yes, day ahead of electricity prices in France go negative because they have 65% of their grid coming from nuclear, which is very difficult to scroll back, expensive to scroll back. And when you overproduce with wind and solar because it's a gusty day or the sun is shining very brightly, you have more power than you need. So it turns out that when you operate the grid, having not enough power and having too much power are roughly the same problem. You have to pay people to take the excess electricity. The proper functioning of a modern electricity grid is a dance of balancing. You must match demand with supply as perfectly as you can. There's very little slack in the system. And so if all the wind turbines are spinning with great velocity all at once, and it happens to be 9 o'clock in the evening and there's no air conditioner units being run, then you have too much power and you have to pay people to take it off your hands, and you have to throttle back your nuclear power plants. And so you disrupt the operation of the grid. So integrated over the totality of such operations, prices go up. But the headline of prices are negative in France is not a meaningful comparison to the average price a French citizen pays as compared to the average price a British citizen pays integrated over the year. Now, as it turns out, it is much cheaper in France because they get 65% of their electricity from fully depreciated, totally operational nuclear power is basically free electricity. They've greenwashed themselves and added some more renewables and other unnecessary things to a grid that was already amongst the greenest in the world. And that has caused extreme volatility in their short-term market balancing price mechanisms. But the average consumer in France is paying a fraction of what the average consumer in the UK, who does not have a meaningful nuclear power contribution to its electricity grid, and is even more heavily dependent on offshore wind, and that offshore wind is in the wrong place. It's in the north, and most of the industrial demand is in the south. And Miliband's brilliant plan is to artificially increase the price in the south and force these factories to move to the north, as though once factories uproot, they have to stay in country. It's this we like to say the stuff of spreadsheet dwellers who've never stepped foot in a factory. So this is the sort of a long-winded answer to your question. But anytime you see a news story about cheap or expensive electricity prices, the first thing you have to ask yourself is, over what time frame for delivery? So year-ahead electricity price is far less volatile than day-ahead electricity price. That's like the first parameter that's missing.
I appreciate that. Thank you for saying that. I think, as I said off there before we started, I know that I've got a lot to learn in the process as well. So now I'm definitely taking that away with a better understanding. Obviously, it's a podcast. People might not watch the video. I'm laughing and hanging my head in shame the minute you mentioned Ed Miliband. And I think we might as well go into the UK then, as we're here. I'm going to almost be a bit of a devil's advocate here. I'm not going to ask very complex questions here, Doomberg. So I just rather ask some very basic questions and get your expertise, because I know a lot of people are going to be listening from the UK, and they're probably going to be wondering, why on earth are my electric, gas, my generic bills, why are they so high? And my question to you, and I think you touched on it a little bit already, but I'll ask it anyway. Why is the UK's energy policy so screwed up at the moment?
So that's a good question. It's one we ponder a lot. To frame what Miliband is proposing to do, I think at the highest level, he has effectively observed what happened in Germany and concluded they did not do enough fast enough, as opposed to pondering whether the entire thesis might not have been nullified by Germany's example. So the thesis is wind and solar are cheap, and we can discard fossil fuels and other baseload sources of power. And once we get enough of wind and solar installed, this green energy utopia will emerge from the wreckage of the economy. The friction of the transition might be very high, but the end state is worth the pain, you know, like a World War II type effort. Let's all get together and defeat Germany, save the empire. So that's what he has decided. I mean, but by the way, Germany is an utterly failed state relative to what it both was and could have been, in a way that's even more extreme than what Miliband is trying to do, because they had a brilliant set of the world's best nuclear power plants that they proactively dismantled in one of the heights of insanity of the modern era. And they are deindustrializing and becoming a rump of what they used to be, as a consequence. And the same fate awaits the UK. Physics dictates it. I don't understand how it is that these people are so poorly advised, because Ed Miliband, for all of his flaws, one of the flaws is that you can actually buy a portrait of the man on Amazon. I didn't know if you knew that. But he's not a dumb individual. In fact, his flaw is he thinks he's smarter than everybody else. Well, to think you're smarter than everybody else, you have to have some sort of base load of intelligence, and he clearly has that. He's an articulate, lucid individual, a learned man, a man of the book, as we might say. And yet he is looking at Germany and deciding he has learned all of the wrong lessons from the obvious example before him, which is why Argentina is such a great a case study in two extremes with the UK that we are watching so closely. I feel for the people of Britain. We wrote a piece about the steel industry. The steel industry in Britain is over. The death knell of the steel industry will be financed by the British government. Happy to talk about why that is. You cannot have heavy industry and a dumb energy policy. So you have to choose one. And Miliband is choosing a dumb energy policy, and the people of Britain will be the ones who suffer, which is quite sad.
Happy, just go that again. So I think that's a great headline for the podcast, thinking about it. So is it happy industry and dumb energy policy?
You can't have a heavy industry.
Heavy industry, sorry. I'm going deaf in my old age, Doomberg.
Right. You can't make steel, you can't make concrete, you can't make chemicals, you can't make automobiles, you can't make composites, aluminum, magnesium, all the stuff that China dominates today. China does not have a dumb energy policy, by the way. They burn as much coal as they can get their greedy little hands on. I mean, they are totally ignoring carbon emissions and climate change and all the hysteria that we've whipped ourselves up into. We wrote a piece about New Zealand called the Wop Whoops, and China added 22 New Zealand's worth of carbon emissions in 2023 alone. Does it matter what New Zealand does to anybody outside of New Zealand? Of course not. No, China emits more carbon in a day than New Zealand does in a year. So the world's carbon emissions will be dictated by China, and China is busily rolling up the production of solar panels, which is very energy intense, the production of magnesium, the production of carbon, the production of batteries, the production of everything that you need, regardless of whatever the West does for its energy policies, will be dependent on the Chinese for our economic future, and they will play those cards to their geopolitical advantage, as they should, by the way. This is a condemnation of Western policy, not of Chinese policy. And so Britain will be left a vassal of its former self. There will be much political upheaval, and it's predetermined. And of course, there will be what we call blame storming, where the media will proactively gather and figure out whose fault it is. It won't be Ed Miliband's fault. It'll be somebody who tweeted something bad's fault in response to the government's policy. That's what's coming. So the crackdown on free speech is a concurrent necessity to stifle opposition to policies that are doomed to fail. It's a toxic concoction of badness that awaits the good people of Britain, and we have deep sympathy for them.
Yeah, I cannot wait to get out of here in January 2025. So I've said that many a times on the Substack, and I'll say it again for the benefit of this podcast. Doomberg, you mentioned there briefly. Thank you, by the way, for giving a headline for this podcast. I love that. Really, really good about industry there. You did mention about steel. Again, I'm going to put the link to the article in this post that comes with the podcast. You mentioned about steel industry and how that's, where that's going. Could you just elaborate that on a bit more for those living here in the United Kingdom?
The modern steel industry owes its origins to the United Kingdom. An inventor in the 18th century invented what has become known as the Bessemer process. Not still used today, but was foundational to the methods that are. And for a while, the UK was the world's leading steel producer. It wasn't a very long while. Germany and America usurped British production and tonnage, at least, very quickly. But the steel industry is one of those sectors that is beyond the sort of raw economic measurements in its importance. It's important for national security. It's important for national prestige. It's important for the robustness of your economy. Having a domestic steel supply chain is considered critical to having a domestic manufacturing sector. And Britain is about to lose its steel industry. It peaked in steel production in the early 70s, and now it's down some 80% from that high water mark. And Miliband and Starmer, in their infinite wisdom, are setting about the task of converting the remaining steel facilities in the country from traditional blast furnaces to electric arc furnaces. And I don't know if you want to go into the details of why that matters, but it is effectively the death knell for the steel industry in the UK. So in a blast furnace, you take iron ore and coal, and you make virgin steel. That's very carbon intense. The coal, much of the coal used leaves in the form of CO2. It's amongst the biggest emitters in any reasonable manufacturing economy, steel and cement. Not much you can do about that if you want to make virgin steel. But there is an alternative way to quote unquote make steel, which is to recycle scrap steel using what's known as electric arc furnaces. And that's fine. It produces a different sort of set of grades of steel, and there are some important grades that you can't produce using that technology, but that's a nuance without much of a difference for today. What does matter, though, is that instead of leaning on coal, you lean on electricity in a much bigger way. And the electric arc furnace technology will roughly double the existing British steel industry's demand for electricity, which is already formidable and comes at a time where the grid is being destabilized by the forced introduction of intermittent renewables. And so you have this amazing strategy where the UK industry already pays twice what Spanish and French industry pays for the same electrons, but we're going to increase the demand for that electricity far more radically in the name of reducing carbon emissions. And so electric arc furnaces based in the UK, these conversions, by the way, are not cheap. 500 million pounds of public money underwriting a couple of the conversions that we highlight in the piece. Once those furnaces are converted, they will lose money, and there will be bailout after bailout after bailout needed. Most of these steel companies are now foreign owned. One of them is owned by a dual citizen who happens to have a British passport. But bailing out foreign-owned steel companies is politically unpalatable. And so those jobs are doomed. So you will pay, the British public will pay to put the British steel industry out of business. That's what's going to happen. There'll be a lot of details between now and then, and a lot of headlines and strikes and worker revolts and crackdowns on social media. But the laws of physics dictate that if you have amongst the most expensive electricity in the continent, certainly radically more expensive than your Chinese competitors, doubling the industry's demand for electricity, which is highly inelastic, by the way, because if you have to turn off your lights to make room for the steel industry, you're not going to be very happy about that. But this is how it ends. They ultimately take as many bailouts as they can, and then they close up shop and go out of business. Because, by the way, for the 4 major steel companies still operating in Britain, their steel assets in Britain are but a minor afterthought to their global assets. And so at some point, the political pain of begging London, hat in hand, for bailout after bailout becomes intolerable, and you just wash your hands of it and leave the country. They're certainly not going to relocate to the north to capture all that cheap wind energy. They're just going to shut the steel plants down, and you will all be importing your steel from China, which, purist would say is the proper economic outcome from this situation.
So much to dig into there. I mean, I could think of a multitude of examples of, good old NIMBYism, not in my backyard. We have an inability to seemingly want to build any nuclear plant. But I'm sure, actually, that actually does bring me to a question, thinking about it before I start ranting. But for those that are not attuned to wind and solar, and I'm sure that most people listening to this are, but can you just go through? So when I think of nuclear, oil, gas, coal, I think baseload energy, and then I look at wind and solar as sort of supplementary. Can you just dig into that just in layman's terms, just so people have an understanding of the craziness that you've just explained with the steel industry, if you don't mind?
You bet. So here's the big sleight of hand. The sleight of hand, or as we like to call it, the great lie, is that you can pivot away from fossil fuels and nuclear towards renewables only with no sacrifice to your standard of living. And that's just plainly wrong. It's literally a trick. And so the major challenge is this: no matter how much wind you have installed, or no matter how much solar you have installed, there will come a time where no energy is produced from those assets. If the wind stops blowing at night, you get zero. And sometimes the wind doesn't blow for a very long time. It's called the doldrums. And sometimes the wind blows way too much, and you have to throttle back these assets. To guide over or paper over this intermittency, you need to install some form of backup. Battery, for example, or water storage, some sort of storage, backup storage needs to be there. And by the way, even hydro is intermittent across timeframes measured in years, which is what we highlighted in the New Zealand piece. New Zealand gets 2/3 of its electricity from hydro. They had a dry year. The water behind the dams is shrinking, and that is causing a crisis. But wind and solar have intermittency on much, much shorter timeframes. And if you have to back up the entire electricity grid for any meaningful amount of time, the amount of batteries you would have makes it prohibitively expensive, which is why renewables are expensive. Anybody who installs a lot of renewables, on average, pays more for electricity. There might be days where it's negative, and proponents, propagandists, I would call them, of this technology point to those time series measurements and pretend like that's some meaningful number when it isn't. And in fact, it's proof of the destructive nature of these technologies. And so just to give you one example, I saw an estimate a few months ago where if you took all of the installed backup battery power in the US, it could back up the US grid for 8 minutes. We've spent untold billions in this regard. So how are you going to back up the UK electricity grid for an entire evening when there's no wind and the sun isn't shining? So once you start doing the back of the envelope math, and by the way, that's just for most of the time. There's always going to be the edge cases where the grid just literally goes down because you have to back it up for, there's no wind for 3 days and it's cloudy. So there's a parameter that captures this. It's called the capacity factor. Another sleight of hand of the renewable propagandists. The capacity factor is defined as the total amount of electricity a power plant does produce divided by the total amount of electricity it could produce if it was operating 24/7, 365. The capacity factor for nuclear is 90% when you have a properly well-run nuclear power plant. The US achieves this integrated across the 90-odd reactors that the US has spinning away across the country today. So 90% of the time, nuclear is producing at its nameplate capacity. And every once in a while, it goes down for maintenance or fuel swapping or whatever. Wind and solar, well, wind is probably around 40%, depending if you're onshore, offshore, where you are in the world. The solar capacity factor for the UK, by the way, like been to the UK a lot, sun doesn't really shine there much, is less than 10%. So if you install a 2 gigawatt nuclear power plant and you install 2 gigawatts worth of solar, you're getting 9 times more electricity from the nuclear power plant. Actually, it's much more than that. It's more like 7 to 8% if Starmer implements his residential solar plan, which is a whole other nuance of insanity. And by the way, it's very predictable. Like exactly when the nuclear reactors are going to run, and you could plan well ahead for their maintenance schedules and so on. The sun is dependent on the weather. But so you have all of this spare capacity for solar. You have to install radically more. But then as you do, after you get about 20 to 30% of your electricity from renewables, there's another phenomenon that just kills you. They're super highly correlated. So if you have to install way more than you need, they all turn on at once when it's sunny. And so then that's why prices go negative. And then the people who have installed these solar panels or these wind turbines can't ever make any money because everybody's trying to make that same money because of this demand matching. Now, if you had a whole lot of storage, you could take some advantage of the excess capacity and bridge you to when you have less of it. But all that storage is expensive. And so here's an amazing thing, Robert. And I stole this from, I borrowed it from somebody who writes a great blog called The Manhattan Contrarian. We're proposing to spend trillions of dollars to run the economy on wind, solar, and batteries. Why don't we try and run a city on it first and see how it does? Let's take a small city, 10,000 people, 20,000 people, a town, we might call it, and just say you are forbidden from using fossil fuels. Let's run that city on wind, solar, and batteries and count the money. Let's see what it costs. Let's see how the grid does. If wind and solar are so cheap, once you install it, the energy is free, sunshine, there's no bill for sunshine. Great. Then you should not be afraid of that experiment. Let's see what it costs to equip a city of 10,000 people with nothing but wind, solar, and batteries. You pick the technology, and we'll even give you a great location, a windy place where it's sunny. And let's see how it does. And let's compare it to nuclear supplemented by natural gas. Or pick your favorite alternative set of technologies. That we haven't done this experiment yet. And we are embarking on rewiring entire countries like Starmer and Miliband are proposing to do is truly insane. Like we come from industry. This is what's known as a pilot plant. Here's how technologies work. You develop it in the lab. It works in the lab. You do a pilot. You do a market development plant. Maybe you build one small facility at sort of market scale, and then the next 5 get built at twice that capacity, and now you've proven the technology. Stuff happens when you scale up, right? I mean, this is what engineers do for a living. Let's engineer a city with nothing but wind, solar, and batteries, and let's see how that city does.
Makes sense. That doesn't mean to me, well, any sane person out there, I think that would be a good place to start. Do your pilot test and go from there, because I'm sure the answers would be, well
I have an even simpler one. Do it at your home. So anybody who is in the preparedness movement, and we are unabashed preppers, we don't view the word prepper as an insult. You should try to operate your home on solar and batteries and see what you have to sacrifice. You get a visceral understanding for the power of fossil fuels when you try to operate major appliances in your home off a battery. And I love batteries. I have lots of solar. I love batteries for backup. But I also have a lot of generators to recharge those batteries in case the grid goes down. But if you try to operate your home on wind, solar, and batteries, or in this case, mostly just solar and batteries, because wind is very difficult, although you can get small wind turbines at the residential level. Just try and do it. Turn off the power to your home for a couple hours and forbid yourself from using fossil fuels of any kind, and run the maths on what you need to maintain any reasonable semblance of your standard of living. And in fact, we've argued that politicians should be forced to do this. Take a week. We're going to turn off the power to your house. Here's the, a suite of investments, and we'll even subsidize you. We'll give you all of the batteries and solar you need. Just try and do it physically and see whether there's enough electrons coming from the sun to keep your batteries charged high enough to keep your family in the lifestyle that it has grown accustomed to. Gee, the fridge works. How do we cook this food? The lights come on. The internet is powered. The computers are recharged. The phones are recharged. It's actually, I'll just give you one small example. A Jackery 2000 battery, with 2,000 watt hours of storage could power a 100-watt light bulb for 20 hours. And that's a multi-$1,000 battery. Now you want to boil some water on that, or you want to make some coffee on that. You're draining 1,500 watts for 15 minutes. That's a big chunk of the battery that's gone, and you have to recharge that battery. Oh, well, let's put some solar panels on it. Okay, I have 400 watts of solar panels that you can buy that comes with this battery. Well, you plug it in and it's a bit cloudy and it's kicking out 120 watts or 100 watts. Well, if it's kicking out 100 watts, it's going to take 20 hours to recharge that battery. Well, there isn't 20 hours of sunshine in the day. So it's going to take multiple days to recharge that battery, which is barely giving you any functionality in your sort of quest for a decent standard of living. Now, let's not even talk about heating your home. You're going to run that heat pump on a battery? All right, let's see how long that battery lasts. It's insane that you could do it for your own home. Just run the maths. If you can't run your home, how are you going to run a city? If you can't run a city, how are you going to run a county? And if you can't run a county, how are you going to run a nation? You're not. It's so no, you're not going to have a steel industry. You don't get to have nice things if you have dumb energy policy.
100%. Yeah, I don't. It's rare that I get lost for words. I think I'm lost for words at the moment. The mind boggles, and yeah, I think moving on. And I should sort of go around worldwide. What I'd like to do, Doomberg, is I just like to dig into New Zealand a bit more. Then we'll head off to China, and then we'll wrap it up with. So I always like to provide solutions, and I know that you're very solutions orientated in your writings as well. So you mentioned an article that you wrote about New Zealand and how almost irrelevant New Zealand is. Yeah, let's go to New Zealand. So what have New Zealand done wrong, or what shouldn't have they have done, and what energy challenges, although you've slightly alluded to them already, what energy challenges have New Zealand faced in the last few years?
So New Zealand's done a few things wrong. And actually, to be fair, not major, but they ran up against sort of full tilt on the pinball machine, perhaps quicker than one might have anticipated. The grid in New Zealand today is 2/3 hydro. They are blessed with enormous hydropower resources. They're a small country, 5 million people. They're a fraction of a percent of global emissions. When we say New Zealand doesn't matter, New Zealand matters a lot to those 5 million people that live there, and it doesn't matter at all to the 8 billion that don't. In other words, New Zealand could do what it wants. It's in the Wop Wops. They're the rural place far away that nobody thinks about. And so they should be focused on food security and energy security. But, Ardern came in and wanted to be seen as caring a lot about climate change. And one of the things that she did was impose a ban on new exploration for natural gas and oil, which, of course, drives away the industry. They shut down, or they oversaw the closure of their one and only refinery, which is insane for an island nation to have no refining capacity whatsoever, to be 100% dependent on imports of fossil fuel products like diesel and jet fuel and gasoline. They don't have much in the way of domestic supply. A couple of weeks and the tanks would be dry. But what really happened to New Zealand is they did this in the face of a unanticipated drought, which has caused the water levels behind their hydroelectric dams, which serves as giant batteries, by the way. A country with a huge amount of hydroelectricity can, in fact, do intermittent renewables because the dams act as giant batteries. Because there's potential energy behind the dam that can be released by opening the spigots to a certain, within limitations. They're pretty good at load following, but the water behind the dams in New Zealand was dropping, and the main backup is natural gas. But since they have imposed this moratorium on exploration for new natural gas wells, what happens is, of course, your domestic production dissipates. Capital flows to where capital is treated well. And if you have a ban, why would you set up shop and all of the fixed costs that come with, drilling in New Zealand when you could just take your rig and go to Argentina? And so production of natural gas in New Zealand was down. And there were fears of rolling blackouts and all of this other stuff. Curtailments of heavy industry, because you can't have nice things if you have a dumb energy policy. And heavy industry will suffer, and maybe they'll stick it out in the hopes of political change until they leave, until they shut down, because they're competing against China, right? I mean, most people are producing goods that sell in the global markets, and you are on a cost curve that competes with China. Now there's a new prime minister. Conservative Party won a plurality of the election after Ardern resigned. Ironically, of course, citing that she didn't have enough in the tank to keep going, which we thought was pretty funny. And they're trying their best to close the barn door. And we suspect they'll muddle through. But it's just an interesting case study of the risks you take when you implement such policies, that the averages don't always materialize, and Six Sigma events happen, and New Zealand is sort of stuck in a bind of its own making. And then to your point about solutions, a single AP1000 nuclear reactor would add a third of electricity production capacity, real production, not nameplate, to the grid, and all but eliminate the need for fossil fuels altogether. $1 couple billion investment. New Zealand could wipe its hands of carbon emissions, because they have hydro and nuclear, and maybe just a spot weld of natural gas once in a while with a few peaker plants. No need for wind and solar. Nuclear is the set it and forget it trade. There's only one catch, of course, which is New Zealand, which, as we said in the piece, has a storied history of virtue strutting for domestic and global audiences alike. In 1987, they passed what's known as the New Zealand Nuclear Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act, which does nothing to minimize the prospects of thermonuclear war, but does make it almost impossible to develop a civilian nuclear energy industry in the country. So they're stuck in a bit of bother, as we might say, in Britain. And it'll be interesting to see how they get themselves out of it.
Moving swiftly onto China, I mean, I see a lot of similarities between the UK and New Zealand there, but let's not go into that. Moving on to the energy behemoth that's China. And I would imagine for most people, they will look at what Europe is trying to do, and I'll use that term loosely, about cleaner energy and all that sort of stuff. And they might look at China and go, well, how dare they use so much coal, and how dare they keep polluting and whatever. I mean, it doesn't bother me personally, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that it would bother. But China, to me, last time I checked in, they're taking the lead on an awful lot of nuclear projects and things that might actually benefit the world. Again, I'm going to take a step back here, Doomberg. I'm just going to ask you the simple question and then leave you to elaborate. What's going on with China, and what are they doing that is likely to benefit people moving forward?
It's a mixed bag. So China emits more carbon than the entirety of the OECD nations combined. China is by far the world's largest producer and consumer of coal. China is executing an all of the above energy strategy, both as measured by technology and geopolitical risk. They don't want to have too many of their eggs in any of that 2x2 matrix of baskets. So this is why they're slow rolling Putin on power Siberia 2, but they're still buying coal from Australia and Indonesia, even though they produce a lot domestically. They are running a well-diversified portfolio of energy projects that allows them to increase the standard of living of their population. And it has been a miraculous story, an economically miraculous story, whatever the impact on the climate is. But we are firm believers in something that we have formulated as Doomberg's postulate, which goes as follows. Essentially, the gating function of fossil fuel consumption is production. Because, and this is the postulate, every molecule of fossil fuels produced will be burned by somebody somewhere, and local restrictions against such activities merely relocate who gets to enjoy the privilege. China will happily burn every spare gram of coal that Britain forgoes. And since Europe, which does not include now the UK and Norway when we say the EU, Europe produces no fossil fuels of consequence outside a bit of a coal for Poland and Germany, and they're not going to stop producing and burning that coal. For oil and natural gas, Europe is an afterthought. And so the amount of oil and natural gas the world consumes is utterly independent of what Europe does. Production is the gating function of consumption. And Indonesia is not going to stop producing. Australia might, Canada might, the US might. They don't seem to be. Record oil and gas production under Biden, very strong coal production under Trudeau, LNG terminals being built, pipelines through mountains for oil being built, a few projects canceled so that everyone can sort of pretend like they care. But by and large, if we look at the statistical review of world energy, 2023 was a record year for the production of oil. It tied a record for the production of natural gas, and it smashed a record for the production of coal. Show me on the chart where climate change matters. It's not there. And so if we don't burn it, if you don't burn it, if Ireland doesn't burn it, if Ireland culls its cattle, if the Dutch shut down half their farms, all of those commodities and raw materials will get rerouted to Brazil and Argentina and China, and they'll happily pay slightly lower prices than they would have otherwise. And they'll carry on their way, uplifting the standards of living of their people. I'll give you one final stat on China, which will blow your mind. For China to raise its population to the same GDP or BTU per capita as the US enjoys. So how much energy does the average citizen of the US have at their disposal? For China to equalize with the US would require the globe to increase its total energy production by 36%. What do you think carbon emissions are going to do along that journey? They're not going to shrink. So whatever your views on climate change, and you might well believe that climate change is a catastrophe and that we should do all that we can to stop it, we're not going to do the things. So you should brace for impact. If you truly think the world is going to end because China is going to burn coal, which they will, and you've been saving a nice bottle of wine, I would advise you not to save it. Break it out and enjoy it while there's still time, because we're going to roll the dice on climate change. And we will just brace for impact. Turns out this year wasn't such a bad year for hurricanes. We were submitted to endless stories about how the oceans were boiling, and this was going to cause a parade of Category 6 hurricanes to swoop up through the Gulf and destroy all the fossil fuel industry, and God will get vengeance upon the polluters of Earth. And yet we've had no hurricane season to speak of. So we're going to roll the dice. We got away with it this year. No major hurricanes. We'll see what happens next year.
Doomberg, that is absolutely mind-blowing. I think that helps to put things into perspective. Now, I'm hoping that people listening to this as well have had their perspectives altered slightly with some of the information you've given. You mentioned earlier about solutions, and we'll start to wrap up now. We're hitting the sweet spot in terms of time. For me, the answer is nuclear, but I'm not as much of an expert in this field as you are. When we look at solutions, maybe what people can do or what countries can do, I just think nuclear, that's what I think. But what would you suggest? I don't know if there is a blanket answer for this. I don't know. It might be country dependent. But if you're in charge of the world and you've got to come up with energy solutions to try and appease as many people as possible. What would you advise? What would you look to do?
Yeah, there is no path to any meaningful decarbonization that does not involve a nuclear renaissance. And the things needed for such a renaissance are standardized designs, standardized supply chains, access to funding, strong public support. We have almost none of that around the world today, and where we do, it succeeds, and where we don't, it doesn't. Britain does not have a glorious history in this regard, by the way. It has kind of fumbled its nuclear energy policy, which is probably a subject for a different podcast appearance. But Canada, for example, has done it very well. Ontario has a practically carbon-free electricity grid run on mostly nuclear, supplemented by hydro, which makes room for a few token pieces of wind turbines. But it can be done. Nuclear is ultra high energy density. All of the so-called challenges with nuclear are made up by Malthusians who don't want the masses to have access to cheap energy because they're concerned about the resource drain that such people will then demand once they have been able to purify their water and irrigate the fields and grow a bit of food for themselves. But nonetheless, the opposition to nuclear is real. It's expensive in the West by design. That's a political choice. It's not expensive in China. China's cranking these out at very manageable cost. It just goes to show China's the exception that proves the rule. Nuclear power and its expense and the time to build are political choices. If we had a World War II type effort where we truly thought the end of the world was coming, and we had to decarbonize, we would actually be seeing a worldwide coalescence around a unified nuclear supply chain and a build out of, but it wouldn't take all that much. We could easily do it. I mean, it would take a lot, but it's not like insurmountable. There are no constraints that are showstoppers, but we won't. And so that's why we believe we're just going to burn coal, oil, and gas and see what happens.
Well, let's see what happens. I think that's a great place to leave it. As I mentioned at the start and throughout this episode, what I'll do with the subsequent Substack post is I'll put links to your Substack in there as well, and the articles that you've referenced as well. If people do want to find you, and they're just listening to this on the podcast, for example, if people do want to find you, Doomberg, how do people find you?
Doomberg.com. We have successfully ejected a squatter from that domain name. So we are now the proud owners of Doomberg.com, and you can find everything there. Robert, it's been great. I certainly enjoyed it. I hope you did as well, and appreciate the discussion and looking forward to the next one.
Likewise, Doomberg. Thank you very much for your time. Fantastic stuff, and look forward to speaking to you soon.
You bet.